Good afternoon, folks. And here's a strange article someone sent to me last week from theconversation.com. I'm assuming this is a British-style website or publication. I don't know. But the topic got me intrigued because it's about Sherlock Holmes. I think most people know who Sherlock Holmes is. Maybe you not have all read all the books by Arthur Conan Doyle, but you might have seen an interpretation or a movie or a series over the years. So I think everyone kind of knows who this dude is. And the title of this article is Sherlock Holmes in the Case of Toxic Masculinity, What is Behind the Detective's Appeal? So this is already a bad premise because you're assuming one thing and then you're saying, why is this attractive? And when you actually look at what makes toxic masculinity, at least the articles that this person links to in the definition of toxic masculinity, you'll see that there's nothing inherently wrong with them. Now, before we start, this is a person who wrote this. Ashley Morgan is a Masculinities Scholar from Cardiff Metropolitan University. So clearly she has her own view of the world and she wants to study men or what have you. That's totally cool. You do you, whatever in your life, you research whatever you like. The problem becomes this modern term of toxic masculinity and how that is somehow, in some way, going to be applied to Arthur Conan Doyle's work hundreds of years ago, or 100 or so odd years ago, in the definition of Victorian era men and women. So let's just get the definition outright. And this is she linked to medicalnewstoday.com. So the exact definition of toxic masculinity has evolved over time, as if it makes even more sense now. In modern society, people often use the term toxic masculinity to describe exaggerated masculine traits that many cultures have widely accepted or glorified. Okay, the harmful concept of masculinity also places significant importance on manliness based on strength, lack of emotion, self-sufficiency, dominance, and sexual virility. So I don't see what's wrong with having significant importance on strength. Strength of body, strength of mind, strength of character, you name it, that's a healthy, good thing. Who needs weak people? Why are you around weak people? Are you a caregiver? Are you helping people become strong? If you're not helping people become strong, you're doing it wrong. We don't need weak people in life. That is a healthy, good thing. This is why we admire people who are dedicated and disciplined to have a physically strong body and mind, to get the degree, to build something. That's a form of strength. That's a good thing. Lack of emotion. Now, this can go back to ancient Greece, the Stoics. These are seen as virtues. Having the way to contemplate existence and its painful exterior. How do you deal with that? What do you do with all these slings and arrows that come your way? Well, you don't burst out like a child. So in a sense, this is a form of adulthood. You learn from your mistakes. You learn not to explode when the universe does not think the same way as you do. You're not some angry little boy. You're an adult. Self-sufficiency. I don't see how that's... I can't even understand how that's bad in any context. You grow up, you're an adult, you're self-sufficient. You can feed yourself, you can clothe yourself, you can get a job, and you're part of the community. How is that toxically masculine? See, not even these terms make too much sense. Dominance. Dominance can mean many things. Usually you want someone who is sure of themselves in a conversation, whether they're being a jerk about the conversation and dominating so the other person isn't allowed to talk is another story. But without actual examples, I'm not sure what this means. Sexual virility. How do you even measure sexual virility in the context of a toxically masculine man? Is that someone who just sleeps around with everyone and impregnates a whole bunch of women? That's being irresponsible and other things as well, which you can see as a bad male behavior. But how do you actually measure sexual virility? What if you're sleeping around and you're very good at charming women, but you don't actually have enough sperm count to allow conception to occur? It's a strange thing to hold the ability to be sexually virile as a form of toxic masculinity when a lot of males, I wouldn't say goals in life, but motivations are based on sex, to procreate. This is how we have humanity. We wouldn't have had humanity if male sex drive was not as high. We'd be much lower in numbers. We wouldn't be as passionate to achieve the things we wanted to achieve, and we wouldn't certainly be as dominant as we were. So I don't see anything wrong with dominance, sexual virility, self-sufficiently in every regard. Lack of emotion, that could mean many things, but in the form of the classical Stoics, that's totally healthy. And in strength, that is always a good thing. So this is the article she linked to. She linked to other articles as well. Anyway, let's try and see what she has to say about Sherlock. So in 2010, a fresh take on Sherlock Holmes burst into British screens on the BBC with Benedict Cumberbatch. And then there was the show Elementary in 2012, which I thought was actually a pretty decent show. These are all adaptations of the original books. So Sherlock's brilliance and skills of deduction are unmatched. While I really enjoyed those shows, I was taken aback by Sherlock's rudeness, exasperation, his disparagement of others, his desire to dominate, and his latent violence. Now this I never quite grasped. I don't recall this in the Arthur Conan Doyle's version, and I don't really recall it in the Elementary version. There are some moments where the BBC version of Sherlock is a little snippety, and he's a little crazy. He sort of just pulls out a gun and starts shooting the walls, which is always a dangerous thing. But it was mostly done for humor and to show that Sherlock was really bored. I saw Sherlock as a toxic man. Now, as a woman studying masculine or masculinities, I would imagine she sees many men as toxic or having toxic tendencies because of whatever she's doing. She's hyper-focused on something. So I would imagine that's the case with most characters. Not knowing the books, I wondered where this came from. Okay, so now she reads the books. Here's an example of the scandal in Bohemia. And of course, she focuses on that one book and has the one female character that means anything to Sherlock, who is Irene Adler. But she didn't mention that. So here's Holmes' perspectives on women, and this is, again, from the narration of John Watson. So already we have a narrator trying to explain his genius friend. So already we have a bad understanding of what's actually happening in the mind of Sherlock. All emotions were abhorrent to his cold, precise, but admirably balanced mind. He was, I take it, the most perfect reasoning and observing machine that the world has seen. He never spoke of the softer passions save with a jibe and a sneer. So if we actually look at the Scandal of Bohemia text, this is the full paragraph. And it starts off as, to Sherlock Holmes, she was always the woman. I have seldom heard him mention her under any other name. In his eyes, she eclipses and predominates the whole of her sex. It was not that he felt any emotion akin to love for Irene Adler. All emotions, and then we continue. He was, I take it, the most perfect reasoning and observing machine. He never spoke with the softer passions. They were admirable things for the observer, excellent for drawing the veil from men's motives and actions, but for the trained reasoner to admit such intrusions into his own delicate and finely adjusted temperament was to introduce a distracting factor, which might throw a doubt upon all his mental results. And you have to understand this, because to him, Sherlock needed that brain addict, that addict where everything was in perfect order for him to do his job. And here's the one, this is from the study in Scarlet, where he has the mind. The example is the brain addict is a person of the mind. And he will have nothing but the tools which may help him in doing his work in this attic. But of these he has a large assortment, and all in the most perfect order. It is a mistake to think that this little room has elastic walls and can distend to any extent. This is in regards to superfluous knowledge like the solar system. He didn't care that the Earth orbited around the sun. It had nothing to do with his mind. It has nothing to do with his ability to deduce and induce problems. This was very important. So emotions were anathema to his actions. And yet, despite that, he admired and respected Irene Adler, a woman. Despite all this, Holmes did not feel anything more than respect and possibly admiration for her. Because Irene Adler was the one person who beat Holmes. He couldn't catch her. And he respects her for that. She was able to predict when Holmes was going to come for her, and she escaped the country. So while Holmes may not be a very emotionally open guy, he did respect women, not only one woman in particular, but above all other women. And there's no other examples I can see in the stories where he is rude to women, or he is hurtful to them, or he damages them in any way. In fact, the Scandal of Bohemia kind of goes about that, where John Watson is, he finds his wife, and there's another girl that Holmes goes with, but never actually makes any advances toward her, despite them in being very mortal danger, and that's kind of his thing. He doesn't want to have relationships of that caliber. It doesn't make him toxically masculine. That just means he doesn't care. Although the concept of toxic masculinity sounds contemporary, it actually has roots firmly in the past. Now, this is where we get a little dicey, because now you're applying your ethics, your morals, your concepts of what's good and bad and right and wrong, what's male and female, to what happened hundreds of years ago. Masculinity researchers have defined toxic masculinity as a performance of traditional male gender roles exhibited by a tendency to dominate others. And there's no example of Sherlock dominating others in the book. He's mostly like a very smart person who wants to be very clear on what he's doing. Men like Donald Trump, for example. So already we know this person's politics, and they had to bring up Donald Trump for whatever reason. It's just this silly article about people supposedly very well versed in the masculine world, and yet can't get past their own politics, where there should be an academic understanding of the Sherlock Holmes character. Holmes is obviously not akin to Trump. To start with, Holmes is a genius, and he hardly exhibits the same level of toxic behaviors that Trump does. So here we have, maybe she should have talked about Trump if she knows what toxic masculinity is all about. But there are elements there. So he's obviously not akin to Trump, but there are elements. Well, guess what? There are elements to every guy. This is how you're going to talk about these things. Maybe not every guy's a genius, but they must have some elements if they're just like Trump. This is unsurprising given that some of these features are seen in the original text. Conan Doyle wrote Sherlock Holmes at a time when traditional masculine values were openly venerated. So were traditional female values. I don't see the problem here. What is wrong with Sherlock Holmes? And we're not going to go into the modern examples because those are silly. That's an adaptation. I don't care about modern adaptations. I care about Sherlock Holmes. Now, if you want to make an argument just for those, fine. For those examples, fine. I don't care. But we're not talking about that when you're bringing up Conan Doyle. Conan Doyle refers to Holmes as a machine, and some academics have suggested that his lack of emotion is both alien and mechanistic. But the recent TV adaptations are contemporary portrayals of Sherlock Holmes. The original mechanistic man of his books has necessarily been updated. Again, that's irrelevant. You're doing two different things. You're comparing apples and oranges. It's an adaptation. It's not the original source. So toxic masculinity is a contentious issue, and some consider it to be encompassing traits which contribute to the dominance and brilliance of some men. Arguably, Sherlock Holmes is widely understood as the most brilliant detective of all time. In this context, I found it disappointing that the toxic elements, which we're sure not exactly what she's referring to, of Sherlock's character were not further challenged in the TV shows. So she's saying the elements were there in Doyle's examples, and maybe I missed them, but I see nothing wrong with describing Holmes as a machine, because he's so good at what he does. While he is not actually violent, unlike many toxic men, okay, so he's not mostly toxic, he's somewhat toxic, and the characters around him do call him out on his behaviors, especially Watson, his intelligence is still understood through his toxic masculinity, especially in Sherlock, where it is presented as sexy. I find this problematic. Oh, there's the magic word. Sherlock is sexy and toxic. Isn't that funny? She's finding dominance and strength and intelligence and a lack of emotion sexy, for lack of understanding what she's actually talking about. Because she's just, again, this is the big brush they paint on when they start talking about toxic masculinity. They don't know exactly what they're saying. Oh, this man's toxic because he's sexy. Oh my goodness. Can you imagine? Imagine the opposite of these traits. Instead of strength, you're weak. Instead of having a lack of emotion, you're emotional. Instead of being self-sufficient, you're dependent. Instead of being dominant, you're, I don't know, just not in the scene. You're not even there. You're recessive. You're sort of shy. Instead of being sexually virile, you can't produce children. Just answer the question. With all those negative or opposite traits of what is considered toxically masculine, do you think she would find this character sexy? Is that the kind of man you like? A weak man? An emotional man? A passive man? Is that really what you want? I mean, maybe it is. I don't really care. But that does not make Sherlock a negative character or have negative masculine traits. Sherlock was never written as some sort of masculine, dominant person. He was just a brain. Everything else to him was an appendix. He was a thinking machine. And this is kind of a list of things that Sherlock knew. This was kind of a joke to Sherlock when Watson was describing him. This is how it's originally written. Knowledge of literature, nil. Philosophy, nil. Astronomy, nil. Politics, feeble. Botany, variable. Geology, practical. Chemistry, profound. Anatomy, accurate but unsystemic. Sensational literature, immense. Plays the violin well. Is an expert single-stick player, boxer, and swordsman. So he can fight. He can use the single stick, which is basically a fencing stick, and he's good at swordplay. Has good practical knowledge of British law. How is that toxically masculine? What is wrong with having those traits? What is wrong with focusing his mind to be the best detective he can possibly be? There's nothing toxic about that. In fact, that is an admirable thing in any job you have. To be the best you are at something, to be dominant, to be strong, to be sure of yourself, to make a living for yourself, and to maybe even have children as a result of all your strengths. So if this is toxic masculinity, and that's what Sherlock Holmes is, I wish every man can be as toxic and toxically masculine as Sherlock Holmes. Anyway, thanks for listening. Have yourself a great day.